Season 1 of Westworld was insane, and I'm sure many of us acted just like Dolores.
I'm sorry. I'm trying, but I don't understand.
So whether you're seeking a refresher, need some things cleared up, or just want the gist of the whole show spoiled for you, you've come to the right place. Because this show is rumored to span 5 seasons, and Season 1 is just meant to be this prequel, the appetizer, the prologue before the actual story they want to tell. And while I have another video covering a majority of the little clues, Easter eggs, and other fun facts that you definitely want to check out, in this one, I'm just going to focus on the crazy story that we got and organize it chronologically into 3 parts: before the park, the early years of the park, and the present. So a reminder, freeze all motor functions if you haven't seen the show and don't want to be spoiled, because there's way more to this 10-hour story than I can fit into one YouTube video, and it's definitely worth the binge. But with that being said, let's get into the breakdown. If you haven't seen the movies or are unsure how the amusement park works, it's pretty much set up like this. 1, you have to be filthy rich because a weekend at this park costs 44 grand. 2, there's an actual Delos website where you can go and pretend to sign up, thus showing you the process of booking a trip. And then 3, you pick what role you want to be and enjoy living in the wild, wild west. But how does it work? Well, you can literally do whatever you want: kill, steal, protect, serve, sex, and sex. And once your trip is done, everything just resets. It's a huge metaphor for the way we play video games and watch TV, but physically. Here, all of the dead robots get picked back up and restored. They start their preordained storylines all over again, and meanwhile, you're consequence-free, because the robo-bullets can surprisingly blow up metal and furniture, but can detect human bodies and turn the bullets into BBs. And whenever you're in danger, the hosts, aka the robots, have a Good Samaritan function that makes them protect you. And while that all seems fine and dandy, I'm sure the biggest question would be, well, what about the other guests or falling off cliffs? Well, according to the Delos website, they make you sign a waiver, because for $44,000, they could only do so much, and then you're on your own. So let's get into the actual story. As I covered in my other video, there are hints that the present time of the show, which is really the future, takes place in 2052. And we know through dialogue that the park itself has been opened for roughly 35 years, thus putting the opening of the park in 2017, if they don't change the times on us. This is where we meet the 2 biggest characters, Arnold Weber and Robert Ford, who think of them as the Steve Wozniak who creates the code for the machines, while the other is the sweet talker who creates the company. According to Ford himself, him and his partner Arnold spent 3 years living in the park, refining the host and creating every single part of Westworld before a single guest set foot inside. They were so close that Arnold later built a replica of Ford's entire family based off of one of his favorite childhood memories. And thus, the picture they take includes Ford's robot father right in the center. During this time, however, Arnold ends up losing his son Charlie, which sucks because eventually in this world,
we can cure any disease, keep even the weakest of us alive, and one fine day perhaps we shall even resurrect the dead.
It's safe to assume that him and his wife probably split because of this, and he devoted an insane amount of time into his work, with Dolores being the first host he made, akin to Ford's old Bill, a robot they both have and have private conversations with. Arnold's main drive then becomes in making the host sentient and not letting another one of his creations be taken away.
Arnold always held a somewhat dim view of people. He preferred the hosts. He begged me not to let you people in. The money men. Delos.
He didn't just want to create cool robots, but consciousness, and Ford disagreed. Arnold saw the development in the form of a pyramid with 3 levels: memory, improvisation, and then self-interest. He then followed a theory called the bicameral mind as a blueprint, where the hosts would hear their own programming as inner monologue until one day their own voices would take over. The dude even built a church in where the hosts who were hearing the voice of God would go to, but most of them never really reached consciousness and would just go crazy hearing Arnold's voice.
Arnold had watched his son come into this world, and then he'd watched that light extinguished. What he had lost in his son, he tried to rekindle in you. He created a test of empathy, imagination, a maze. He'd gotten the idea from one of his son's toys.
Even though Arnold created a maze to help lead the host into consciousness, Ford would not budge, and so he committed the biggest act he could to help delay the park, instigate Ford, and above all, put an end to his grief.
In you, Arnold found a new child, one who would never die. The thought gave him solace, until he realized that same immortality would destine you to suffer with no escape, forever.
He uploaded the personality of a serial killer to Dolores. She jacked up a bunch of the hosts, and Arnold commits suicide through her, leaving Ford to replace everyone but the one person he couldn't, his partner.
The stakes must be real, irreversible. He can bring all of them back. But not me.
However, that didn't stop Ford. Since Arnold was practically a hermit with his work, most people didn't meet him, and those that did thought he just committed suicide on his own. Ford even states, "My business partners were more than happy to scrub him from the records, and I suppose I didn't discourage them. They rushed to get the park opened and do, except they're struggling with funding, until a certain investor arrives at the park." Now, Logan is the son of a wealthy business CEO, aka the Delos company, who's on a trip with his soon-to-be brother-in-law, Billy, who we'll just call William. The park's been open for roughly 5 years at this point, so Logan's been there a couple of times, and supposedly so has his sister.
Tell her my sister didn't ride her share of cowboys when she was here.
What's crucial to note by this point is what Ford is planning, because you see, everything, and I mean everything we see in the show, is orchestrated by Ford's touch.
We know everything about our guests, don't we? As we know everything about our employees.
So with him knowing William's background and how he ticks, he purposefully sets up Dolores to cross paths with him, thus setting him on his journey.
I was able to keep going only because I found, or rather you found, an investor who believed in this place.
From William's perspective, he falls in love with the park because he finds who he truly is and, well, goes nuts and bolts for a robot. This ticks off Logan, who reminds him that he's engaged to his sister, which I'm pretty sure we can all agree is just one of those prearranged marriages to help you get to the top, but then Logan also just wants to have fun. This pushes the dude to rip open Dolores and keep William as his prisoner, thus making him seem like one of those crazy kids who breaks your Xbox because you're not playing with him. Of course, this causes William to also go crazy. He then enslaves Logan, scavenges the park, and then strips his bro of his clothes, releasing him to the wild to make him go crazy. Thus, when they find him, Mr. Delos is gonna think that his son is unfit and crazy, thus promoting William instead. That way, Will can up the stocks in Westworld, keep it running, and be in charge. Until he plays himself and realizes that the journey he went on was all fabricated. His heart breaks, and so he becomes the Man in Black. Rewinding a bit back to Ford though, we start to see his master plan. And even though he seems to contradict himself sometimes and be against Arnold, we see that through his actions, he's been trying to correct himself and fulfill Arnold's goal, to actually help make the hosts sentient.
It was when Arnold died, when I suffered, that I began to understand what he had found, to realize I was wrong.
He himself considers what he did as a mistake and has been trying to correct it.
Any man whose mistakes take 10 years to correct is quite a man. Mine have taken 35.
So, in the process, he realizes that Arnold was missing a step in his triangle.
Arnold didn't know how to save you. I do.
And that was through pain. Because from this point forward, he set up all of the hosts to suffer in order for them to reach consciousness, be it through the guests who come to have their way with them, or the gruesome storylines that are happening in the background even when no guest is around.
That was Arnold's key insight. thing that led the hosts to their awakening. Suffering.
His belief was that there could only be room for one, that in order for humans to exist, we had to get rid of the Neanderthals, that it's through violence or a purge that another species can exist, and he wants to be the god of them.
You can't play God without being acquainted with the devil.
It's a sacrifice Ford is willing to make, to give up his own species in order to push evolution.
And we create life itself out of chaos.
He even recreates Arnold into Bernard so he can have the perfect sidekick, yet he still gives him the memory of his child's death, so it can be his cornerstone, to have that thing that pushes him. Now in the present, we pretty much have three storylines: the Delos crew, Maeve's, and then Bill and Ted and their excellent adventure. So starting off with them, we see that William is now a dude whose wife despises him because she ends up siding with her crazy brother, and can assume he ignores his daughter since he's always away at the park scalping hosts' minds. On a quick tangent, it's interesting to note that the character of Chrissy, who William scalps, was actually supposed to have a deeper story, but the actor portraying him passed away a little after filming, and thus that idea was scrapped the same way Walt's storyline was condensed and lost when the dude grew too fast. But back to older William. We know that he's aware of Arnold's existence, the maze, and even though they tell him it's not for him, he embarks to find it himself because he wants the host to be as vibrant as Dolores was when he first met her. However, the dude does kind of own the park and can literally get the cheat codes, but I guess he likes being a cowboy, and so he does. Next up is the Delos crew. They now have a stuck-up writer who only cares about his stories and doesn't like them being meddled with, the oldest Hemsworth brother who seems to be the only security guard that gets how prone to a robot apocalypse they are, and Elsie, who studies the host behaviors and is also my favorite character. But let's focus on the Delos senior manager, Theresa, the person in charge of making sure that things don't get too crazy and of course keeping Ford in check. She recalls hosts that are starting to improvise, meddles with Ford's new narrative, and has even put satellite links in some of the hosts to send out info from the park. However, remember, nothing gets past Ford. Theresa just so happens to be sleeping with Bernard, who, as we know, is pretty much a second pair of eyes for Ford. And technically, the entire park is a second pair of eyes for Ford. So when Ford threatens her to stay away, Charlotte, the executive director of Delos, who's like in her 30s, comes in determined to overthrow Ford because Theresa can't. She meets with Theresa in the most awkward way to set up a plan, or as she puts it, a blood sacrifice. Thus, they mess with Clementine's code to make her seem crazy and throw the blame on Bernard, and so they got a host fired, which Ford is amused by. The sad irony is how Clementine always wanted to go someplace cold, and now she's been put into cold storage. But it's not as bad as where Theresa's going. After dumping our boy Bernard, they get back together to go seek out some info on Ford and go to the secret cabin Arnold built for him all those years ago. And in a Hodor fashion, we get the biggest reveal about Bernard and follow them down to a secret lab that Ford has had all along. We see that he's been creating his own hosts, Bernard being one of them, and a new one that could either be a replicant of Theresa or even more so, one of himself. It's there where Ford uses Bernard to kill Theresa, but not before he notices her pull this trick, the same one he installed in Bernard, and reminds her one last time that he's always listening.
The situation demands a blood sacrifice.
With Theresa dead, Charlotte manipulates Lee to upload all of the info into a host that they can sneak out of the facility, and they end up choosing the one who's already going violent, which is not smart. Meanwhile, Bernard starts realizing who he is, a host and a replicant of Arnold, and as he has this breakdown and confronts Ford about it at gunpoint, he realizes also that he's done this before, and that Ford plays along because he hopes one day things may play out differently. But they don't. This leads us to the final host, Maeve's. We know Dolores is already on her quest to finding her inner self, and she does, but does Maeve? We know that her cornerstone is her daughter, that memory of a loved one she can't get rid of, and it's years later when she's rewritten to serve in the saloon that she starts to realize what she really is. By manipulating two employees, one of whom may be a host, and the other who no doubt Ford set up himself because of how dumb he is, Maves is able to go over 9,000 and gain all these incredible abilities when they pump up her HP. She plans her escape and comes across a dead Bernard right where Ford left him to be found. They boot him back up, and we realize why Ford put him there. To reveal to Maves that everything she's done has been planned, but also so she would keep the memory of her daughter, for her to realize it's her cornerstone. She pulls a massacre and escapes only to make it to the train where she turns on her programming and leaves. Now, some have speculated on whether Dolores and Maves are fully sentient or not, and the answer is actually pretty concrete when you hear what the producers have to say. They dropped hints with them not only making their own decisions, but stylistically, the entire show is steadily shot except for the two moments that they switched to handheld, thus showing you that they're finally free. So, overall, we see that we have Maze coming back to look for her daughter in one of the extra parks on the island. Dolores has finally found her inner voice. Lee tries to sneak out Abernathy only to realize that all the hosts have been set free, and William, Charlotte, and all of the other Delos board members are at Ford's farewell meeting where there's practically no security guards because they're all kind of busy with a distraction. And so Ford explains his final narrative.
It begins in a time of war with a villain named Wyatt. And a killing. This time by choice.
It's important to remember that while Dolores has reached consciousness, she can still be manipulated by Ford, the same way humans hold consciousness, yet still get manipulated by each other. And so she does exactly what he wants.
I'm sad to say, this will be my final story.
But like Mozart, Beethoven, and Chopin, Ford will always be playing. And so ends the first chapter of creation, and the story of a God who created life. A life just as ours, where we question why we suffer and why we feel pain, where we seek answers and seem to get back silence. But it happens for a purpose.
And I'm afraid in order to escape this place, you will need to suffer more. And now, it is time to say goodbye, old friend.